There we are.
Traveling theory, I think, works really, really well as a concept for what we're actually doing on the course. And for people that haven't read Said before, Said really defined, along with Spivak, the post-colonial theory field. He died in 2003. He's a Palestinian post-colonial literary theorist, professor of English and history and comparative literature at Columbia, where Spivak still is. Said has, from very early on, or was from very early on, a public intellectual. Okay, so we've got some public intellectuals on the course. Butler's a public intellectual. Zizek's a public intellectual. Said's a public intellectual. Spivak is pretty much a public intellectual too. Of all of those, I would say the two that are most known as public intellectuals that would be speaking at events and stuff and protests in case of Said are Said and Zizek. So the Said Reader is where traveling theory is from. It's published in a number of places. His book, Orientalism, which he became very well known for, what Orientalism does, and these are different editions of it. How many people here have done excerpts of Orientalism in classes? So 2 people? Just 1 person? 2 people, okay. And Cody, would you just make sure it's still recording by looking up? Yeah, okay, thanks. So when you get a chance, take a look at Orientalism, because what Said does, he also does a great book on Freud, which we've done in Psychology and Politics. So what his book Orientalism does is politicize Orientalism, which is an art historian term for Western depictions of the Orient and for Western studies of the Orient. It basically, he shows that it's kind of an us-them social contract. So everything that's not us is then dumped onto them. Said shows that the West created the cultural concept of the East. Now we kind of know this now, right? Like we know this in terms of discursive construction, particularly in art history. But we didn't know it so overtly before Said showed how it was done. So he shows that the West, the book is very thick, it's really worth looking at. Said shows that the West created the cultural concept of the East, which according to Said, allowed Europeans to suppress the peoples of the Middle East, the Indian subcontinent, and Asia from expressing and representing themselves as discrete peoples and cultures. And so if you look at this is the page 1, which is worth reading out of Orientalism, the quote there, where it says, the Orient was a European, and this is Said, in Said's words, was a European invention. It had been since antiquity a place of romance, exotic beings, haunting memories and landscapes, remarkable experience. That's his beginning. Examples of Orientalism that he cites are discourses of the East as sexually lascivious or repressed, constructions of Arab and Muslim men as terrorists in the war on terror, women as China doll, dragon lady stereotypes, and what you get, this last one, which has Western obsession with the veiling practices of South Asian and Middle Eastern bodies. What you've got is more and more obsession with the veiling practices, and a politicization of the veiling practices by the West out of the context in which for which veiling takes place. So Said, and there's way more, but these are things that he sort of mentioned in Orientalism in the first chapter. Now his book, Freud and a Non-European. And the reason I've got this here is for this quote that's up there, because I think it sums up what he's doing in traveling theory. Said's a very generous thinker, actually. Okay, and he teaches people, it's interesting because, you know, if you're really angry with how thought has depicted you throughout history, and if you're really angry, which you have a right to be, and if you're really angry in a Western university setting, what Said says is something interesting. He says, I'm always trying to understand figures from the past whom I admire, and he's thinking there of Marx and Freud, for example, even as I point out how bound they were by perspectives of their own cultural moment. He also is referring to Hegel there. So he tries to understand them as he points out how bound they are by perspectives of their cultural moment, as far as their views of other cultures and peoples were concerned. So he really does both. And he says that's what he's doing with Freud there. And he goes on to say, and I think this is a really insightful quote as well, it's from Orientalism. Every empire tells itself and the world that it's unlike all other empires, that its mission is not to plunder and control, but to educate and liberate. And he's thinking there of the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, they're always the American Empire, the idea that basically what you're extending in terms of imperialism or neo-imperialism is education and liberation. And so Said would say these, like Spivak, but these, like Fanon, but these terms are loaded terms. Like when you hear a dominant power, a hegemonic power saying, you know, like Afghanistan's an excellent example, where the Americans are saying they were there to educate women. Make sure that girls received education. So what Said's saying is like every empire does that. They use it, as a excuse for extending economic and political imperialism. And then if you think of, take a look at China and Hong Kong at the moment. And you know, what's really interesting is that the pro-democracy group won all the local elections except one. They were going to be listened to, and then the next day, the announcement is no, it's not going to have any effect because you know, Chinese government got a hold of the leader there. So it's really and what Said says then is his approach. And again, this is not in this reading, but I think it's worth noting. He says he tries to see the thinkers, whether it's Freud, whether it's Fanon, whether it's Marx, Hegel, in their context as accurately as possible. Okay, but because they are extraordinary writers and thinkers whose work has enabled other alternative work and readings based on developments of which they could not be aware, he sees them in a music term, contrapuntally. I see them contrapuntally, that is, as figures whose writing travels across time, culture, ideological boundaries in unforeseen ways to emerge as part of a new discourse and ensemble with later history and subsequent, along with later history and subsequent art. So he says that when they travel, they take, because of the time they're going through, because of the culture they're going through, and because of the ideology, they take on changes. But ideas, if they're good ideas, if you're a good thinker, are never going to stay stagnant. That they're going to travel as they're used by other people. Said says that every writer, of course, is a reader. And as readers, we're readers of our predecessors. But he says, what I want to underline is that the often surprising dynamic of human history, what happens is surprising dynamics of human history can dramatize what's latent in a prior figure or form that suddenly illuminates the present. So they may not have been all that radical in their time period, They may not have been all that on the mark, but what's latent there may illuminate the present. So this is more me. Probably, developed from Spivak and Said. No reading is neutral or innocent. Like when you think, we talked about this last week, when you think you're doing a neutral and innocent reading, you're probably like falling into like liberalism. And by the same token, every text and every reader is to some extent the product of where they started, of a theoretical standpoint that's however implicit or unconscious, so they're the product of a theoretical standpoint, however implicit or unconscious such a standpoint may be. So when I first learned this, then I was like, okay, this is really helpful. What are sort of the theoretical standpoints that affect how I think? Okay, I mean, I can name some of them. Obviously, existentialism was a big one because I happened to be studying undergrad in Winnipeg when existentialism was really big. Okay, political economy also was big in that I was taking it at a formative time. Not that I work with political economy. Marx was big. Feminist theory, second, third, and fourth wave feminist theory was always big. Post-structuralism, postmodernism, post-colonial theory then became one of the standpoints, one of the theoretical standpoints that affects how one reads. And Heidegger, but Heidegger against Heidegger, right? So I mean, if you ask yourself, I think it's a good question, that every reader is to some extent the product of theoretical standpoints. You can ask yourself, well, what are the theoretical standpoints that I may not be overtly using, but that actually influence me? So with Heidegger and Husserl, it's phenomenology, right? So there's a whole trajectory. I mean, part of the thing is, if you're a dynamic thinker and you don't freeze your thought, like at a certain point, you will have, by my stage, a whole series of theoretical standpoints that actually inform how you think. Psychoanalysis, both Lacanian and Freud, like these things all kind of go in to how one thinks. So texts that are of their time stay there. So I would say none of the texts on the course are of their time. They're texts, so when we do Sorel then travels. You can see him traveling in Theorist's second term, including Fanon, Benjamin, Zizek. So texts that are inherently of their time end up staying there. They just get left. Those that brush up against historical constraints are the ones that we keep generation after generation. Hegel, Marx, Kant. The people on our course. You can think of literary texts as well. That you can think of texts that have endured, throughout history, and then you think of like texts like, that's very specific. So I'm thinking of this new book out called The Twitter Machine, which is kind of interesting, and we'll do it in cyber politics. But it's specific to now, and I kind of doubt that it's going to endure. But what's interesting is the theorists that are used in the text have endured from previous times. And that's what Said is talking about. So just as an example, for Freud, what Said says is, he says Freud, interesting, like Marx, like Hegel, lends himself especially to rereading in different contexts. For Freud, his work is all about how life history offers itself by research, recollection, reflection, to endless restructuring at the individual and collective stance. So then you see what Fanon, secretary will see what Fanon does with Freud in terms of the Oedipal complex. How it doesn't really work in a war-torn independence struggle situation. Now, traveling theory is quite a short essay. And what Said does there is he sets out how theory, in order to be alive, has to travel. So he starts here. He starts with Lukács. It's not important that you've read Lukács or Goldman or Williams. If you have, like, that's a bonus, but I'm certainly not expecting that you have, because Said is using them to show something. But what's interesting is Lukács doesn't start off in a vacuum. Lukács starts off right back at Hegel with recognition. So Hegel's concept of recognition, 1870 Jena. Then Karl Marx develops Alienation in the 1844 Paris manuscripts and Commodity Fetishism. Both of those you've read. And that's 1867 London. Lukács, 1920s Budapest Revolution. What he develops is a concept of reification, which then Lucien Goldman, who was a student of his, turns into world vision, or it develops into world vision and collective consciousness in 1950s Paris. And it gets watered down with Goldman in terms of a political edge. Raymond Williams, who was a very well-known cultural theorist, comes up in 1970s Cambridge with reflective theory. So you can see, what Said does is he uses this example of George Lucas. It's not George. It is. Lukács, that's it. I was using the film director's name. It's Lukács. He uses the example, spelled correctly. It's correct there. The example of George Lukács, his concept of reification and class consciousness that gets revisited by Lucien Goldman, and then Lucien Goldman's concepts of world vision and collective unconsciousness which are derived from Lukács, that gets revisited by Raymond Williams. So he's taking a look at three of those. Now, I'll take a look at this trajectory again, but I want to go through what Said means by traveling theory and the four components of traveling theory, because he outlines four components. And so he says, first of all, there's a point of origin, a set of circumstances in which the original theory comes into existence and enters discourse. So if you go back with Hegel, with what Lukács is doing is Hegel's recognition. And you're like, okay, well, who went before Hegel? Well, you probably have to go back and take a look at Aristotle, I would say. So what Said says is that there's a point of origin, that is a set of circumstances in which the original theory comes into existence and enters discourse. There's a distance traveled, a passage through the various contexts as the idea or ideas move, as they're transplanted from an earlier point to another time and place where they take on new importance. So if you think of the time, so 1807, 1867, 1920s, 1950s, 1970s, and it keeps going. And you could say, okay, what Said's doing with it, and I think he wrote this, and he gave it as various talks, but I think it was like 1990s, maybe prior to 2000 in terms of traveling theory. And I might actually say, right on 1982 was the first one that he wrote on traveling theory. And that's the one that's collected in the Said reading. So then you could say Said, 1982. So there's a traveling that goes from 1807 in Vienna to 1867 in London to 1920s in Budapest to 1950s in Paris to 1970s Cambridge to 1980s New York City and Palestine. So the traveling theory, he says, thirdly, there's a set of conditions. That's conditions of acceptance or resistances, which then confront the transplanted theory, idea or ideas, making possible either its introduction or toleration or its disappearance. And what you get for the fourth condition, or movement, you've got a full or partly accommodated or incorporated idea that's transformed by its new uses. And it's transformed by its new position in a new time and place. So ideas are never stagnant for a Said. They transform as they're used. And they transform according to the theorist using them and thinker using them, the time, the also place in history. So like persons, and like ideas, theories travel from person to person, from situation to situation, from place to place, from one time period to another time period. And this is the pattern that we went through that Said identifies. Then he talks about, sort of in the middle of the article, he talks about the blurring of distinction between one discipline and another. So here he's referencing philosophy, literature, literary criticism using post-structuralism, Lacanian psychoanalysis, and semiotics. And I thought, okay, we've talked about these before. We've talked about, I think, as early as Foucault on the Enlightenment, I sort of set out what people mean when they refer to post-structuralism and postmodernism. And then we sort of talked about it, we set it out again in Butler. And it's really simple, a critique of all grand totalizing narratives, of all universal claims, of all claims that this is the truth, transcendent claims to truth, and the recognition that the subject is created by structure, by power relations, by knowledge practices. Now, Said would agree with this, okay, that would be, and he's a Marxist thinker, okay? But you can do Marx without having grand totalizing narratives and making universal claims. Then when you look at Lacanian psychoanalysis, and we did this in the section on Lacan and the gaze, I mean, one of the things that Lacan brings to Said, that Said takes from Lacan, is that the unconscious is structured as a language. And that really our world is constituted by these three interrelated levels of the imaginary, of a symbolic, which is the rule of law, which is speech, which is discourse, which is the rule of the Father, and the real, that which kind of cuts through, that which is going to cut through and expose the power embedded in the symbolic, expose what, Kant would call the uncanny. And the imaginary, of course, is this sort of oneness with the mother that then passes. He also says, okay, we're influenced by semiotics, Saussurean linguistics, which we took a look at in terms of, I think, Butler. The idea that you've got a sign, and there's a signifier, the physical existence that signifies this sign. It can be sound, word, image. What gets signified is a mental concept. So he says, look, these four components, there's a distinction between disciplines when these four components are being used. And he's interdisciplinary in terms of philosophy, literature, literary criticism, and post-structuralism. With Said's very interdisciplinary. He says that the blurring of distinctions between disciplines has come to be known as interdisciplinary scholarship. Now, if you take a look at our university, and I mean this is partly thanks to Said and Spivak, it has both undergraduate and graduate courses and programs in interdisciplinary studies. I mean, I'm on an artists committee this year who's in interdisciplinary studies, which allows her, she then works with, myself, people from performance, people from voice, another philosopher. So in that sense, she does both a performance piece, a production of an object, and a game. She's well known for performance artists. The driving force, and we talked about this in Butler's lecture, So what I'm doing is just kind of doing Said and then also linking him with what he's drawing on. So he says that what brings these together, or a driving method in critical scholarship since 1982, is intersectionality, since the 80s. Of course, it's introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw. It's a framework for understanding the ways that the multiple aspects of our identities intersect, influence one another, and create unique experiences. You know, so Said really thought the way he did, partly because he was trained in literary theory. He was born in Palestine. He did work on post-colonial situations. He was trained in Marx. He was also trained in existentialism. So all of that contributes to the intersection of producing, you know, Edward Said, right? He was in New York in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. He's also extremely responsible, or very responsible, for producing a whole generations of post-colonial scholars, either in person or through his book Orientalism, through the reading of it. So the concept of intersectionality, as we talked about in Butler, is used to describe the ways that societal privilege and oppression is complicated by different parts of our identity that are marginalized or privileged in society. So if you see yourself there, you've got all of these things going on. You've got gender, sexuality, ability, age, social economic status, race, ethnicity, sex, and more. Like you also say, and etc. Everybody's got, like, you know, layers of oppression, layers of identity. So intersectionality, layers of oppression end up being caused by gender, race, ethnicity, ability, class, age, sexual orientation, etc. 1989 was when that became published as sort of a coherent theory by Crenshaw, but it was being used before. I mean, Said was talking about this in Orientalism, but he wasn't talking about it as sort of the identifiable term the way Crenshaw did. So Said says that this specific problem, I'll just go to here to do this, but the specific problem of what happens to a theory when it moves from one, and I think this is really fascinating, when it moves from one place to another, Said says is an interesting topic of investigation. It's actually quite fascinating. And you know, it says disciplines like literature, history of ideas, history of political thought, these disciplines don't have, which is one of the reasons we like them, they don't have enclosing limits. They're not bounded. This means that we can and should raise questions of theory, how it's used, and of criticism in ways suitable to the situation in which we live, in which we find ourselves. You can say, hey, Hegel doesn't fit. Okay, how does Hegel not fit in a situation in which we live? What is Marx missing, for example? And so he does this. So Said, of course, is calling for not just a historical approach, he's calling really for a historical materialist approach. He is the Marxist, he is influenced by historical materialism, which allows him to say, as a result of this is from the Traveling Theory, as it quotes here. The page numbers are off on it, and you can't see them, so. Said says that as a result of specific historical circumstances, a theory that pertains to those circumstances arise. You know, Fanon and lumpenproletariat, for example. That a theory or idea or concept, which is why your papers, you know, I want you to do, like, the idea is a concept paper. That as a result of specific historical circumstances, an theory or an idea pertaining to those circumstances arises. That they don't arise ideas and theories don't arise out of nowhere. That they're very much grounded, as Foucault says, in time and place and knowledge fields. So then Said questions what happens to this theory or idea when it's used in different circumstances? It's used for new reasons, and it's used again. And then what happens when it's used again after that, in more different circumstances? That he says, okay, they don't stay the same. It doesn't have the same meaning. What he wants to do is show you. So he goes out. Now, what you probably don't know is that Lukács in the 80s had made a real comeback. He was really a big theorist. So anytime you took a course on critical theory, Lukács would be on. His concept of reification got a lot of currency. Written in 1923 as a study in Marxist dialectics. It's written, it makes a comeback with a difference because it gets picked up and used by Mészáros, which was a student of his, and then it gets picked up and used again by, Leclau and Mouffe, taking on like a different sort of meaning. So it comes back. So when Said is doing his essay in 1982, it makes sense to use Lukács there. So this was published in 1923. Becomes popular again in the 80s. Said goes to Lukács's theory of reification. I'm trying to figure out, I'm going to go close the door because it's not you guys that are talking, it's people inside. So he uses Lukács's theory of reification, which is very popular in 82, to address the first part of his observation. He says, look, as a result of specific circumstances, a theory or idea pertaining to those circumstances arises. So what you get is reification, and you'll see how similar it is to where Hegel, if you break it down, you can take it right back to Hegel's idea of recognition. So reification is a universal fate afflicting all aspects of life in an era dominated by commodity fetishism. So immediately you go, okay, he's drawing from Marx. What is reification? Well, basically it's when the existence of an object takes on a meaning independently from those who produced it. It's very similar to commodity fetishism. So commodity fetishism refers to things created by humans coming to dominate and control humans. This, of course, has its origin, that comes out of Marx. This has its origin in Hegel's claim that the dependent consciousness of the slave or bondsman becomes an independent consciousness and acts as a for itself when it recognizes that the things of the world, that is objects, culture, are creations of theirs, of the people who made it, of theirs that are made through their work. In fashioning the thing, the bondsman's negation of being for self becomes an object for him, her. They've shaped the object which confronts them. In shaping the thing, the bondsman, the dependent consciousness becomes aware the being for the self belongs to them. So that's a direct trajectory of Lukács's concept of reification through Marx's concept of commodity fetishism and also alienation, which we'll get to, which is grounded in Hegel's concept of becoming a for itself and recognition. According to Lukács, again, you can see Marx here, the capitalist mode of production transforms everything human, everything that flows, everything that's a process, everything that's organic, everything that's connected, into what he describes as disconnected and alienated objects. as lifeless atoms, and he describes this in Traveling Theory. So this claim, so Said quotes Lukács saying this in Traveling Theory. So this claim has its origins, of course, in Marx's concept of alienation. The claim has its origins in Marx's 6 aspects of alienation under capitalist production. To return to Marx and labor, labor for Marx is the activity of objectification through which humans externalize themselves in the natural world and by so doing realize their potential as a species being and as a social being, and develop the world, the external world, to their own purpose. So you can see how this is a development of Hegel's claim of the bondsman dependent consciousness recognizing itself in the things of the world they've made, and in this recognition acting as a for itself. Now, just as a refresher, the section we did on alienation in Marx, it includes 6 components. Some people say 4 components, I always say 6 components. When they say 4, they lump some of them together. So then the 6 components of alienation is, as human beings, we're alienated from our labor. That's our free creative productive activity, which then produces human self-alienation. So we're alienated from the product of our labor, we're alienated from the labor process, we suffer human self-alienation, we're alienated from our species being, which is free creative activity, life activity. We're alienated from nature. So we're alienated from our species being and from nature. Those are sometimes put together. Consequently, we're also alienated in our social relations from other human beings, where the social relations take on the relationship between things. That is reification for Lukács. When social relations are reified as relations between things. You can see how Said likes Spivak, and partly they're both literary theorists. It's a way that literary theorists write, whereas theorists tend to develop more as they're going. Literary theorists tend to sort of jump right in, assuming that you actually know the material they're talking about. And in our case, we do, okay? In our case, we may not know Lukács's work, but we certainly know Marx and Hegel's, where it's developed from. So what Lukács says then about reification is that in the situation of reification, and he says reification is the state that accompanies capitalism, like commodity fetishism, alienation, reification, they are embedded in capitalism. They are part of capitalism. They sort of, you don't have capitalism without these. So he says that in the situation of reification, which is the state one lives in under capitalism, what happens is that time, which flows, which is processional, which is not static. He says time sheds its qualitative variable flowing nature. It freezes. It freezes into a quantifiable continuum that ends up being filled with things. And it ends up then being filled with this reified, mechanically objectified performance of the worker, separate from the total of human personality. In short, time becomes space. And this here is Said summarizing Lukács in Traveling Theory, so he's giving you the highlights there. that under reification, time then becomes frozen and reified into space. Also, what happens is the object and subjects of labor end up being fragmented. And when you objectify your labor power into a thing, rather than recognizing it as yours, that you created this product, it ends up coming back, it ends up dominating you. Ends up, being opposed to the total personality. But the labor that's made it, the labor power that's made it is objectified, and it's objectified into something that is opposed to the total personality, where labor power becomes a commodity. So you can see, and he says this is what Marx calls alienation. So you can see how Lukács really develops reification from alienation, from Marx's understanding of the alienation of labor power, and the alienation of the worker from the product that they produced, from fellow workers, from their free creative life activity, from each other, and from the product that they have made. So both Marx and Lukács see alienation, or they see that alienation from Marx and reification from Lukács are what they consider the permanent reality of workers' daily lives in capitalism. So Lukács is taking Marx and Hegel, he's taking a look at them in the context of 1920s Hungary, and he's developed the concept of reification. And what both Marx and Lukács are describing is the permanent reality of workers' daily lives in capitalism. Lukács puts Marx's 6 features of alienation that sort of constitute the overall condition of reification in terms of subject-object relationship. And he's calling for a reconciliation between subject and object, the external world of things, and thoughts are those who made it. He says that when there's a reconciliation between subject and object, the external world of things, objects, and those who made it will come together. There'll be a reconciliation. There won't be objects dominating those who made them, and this will happen when the subject becomes class conscious, which takes you right back to Hegel, when the subject becomes a for itself and becomes aware that their surrounding world they created. That is, the subject becomes class conscious and aware that it created the world of things. And that as a subject, they have been separated from this world of things, from these objects, by the structure and process of capitalism. So very similar to Hegel and Marx, but Lukács develops this, and Said is saying what Lukács says. Lukács then refers to it. He refers to it in Hegel's terms. That is, the subject and object comes together. There's a reconciliation when the dependent in itself, in Hegel's system, becomes an independent for itself. Achieves class consciousness. So Hegel's right there in Lukács. And Lukács is referring to as acting as a for itself, the way Hegel refers to it, as a transformation of passive, contemplative consciousness into active, critical consciousness. Lukács says, in order to overthrow a system, in order to overthrow a corrupt capitalist system, that you need critical consciousness. And what Lukács has observed is that critical consciousness comes from crisis. Okay, so we're like, well, yeah, there's a lot. Okay, so then the thing, if you want to take a look at, the protests in Hong Kong, for example, critical consciousness is very much coming from crisis. I don't know, does anybody know what's going on in Iran? Is there still a complete news blackout? Or are you getting
I know
some
they
stuff?
did it for like a week or something like that. Where they
I'm
took
sorry?
They took out the internet for.
Yeah,
days.
is it still down or
I'm
no?
not sure.
Is up now?
I think, I'm not sure, I think it's like, I know now they've been a lot more than like a week ago. Like,
Are there,
anything.
yeah, are there still protests going on?
Yes.
Now what's interesting, and are they still like really sort of large protests that integrate like a lot of members of society? Yeah, because Iran is very interesting that there's a certain point every so often that there's this crisis where critical consciousness comes together, almost brings down the regime, and then it gets either, usually it gets the force of the regime comes back on the people. But so Lukács is saying, look, you become aware, you have critical consciousness when you're in a crisis situation. But a crisis situation will lead to critical consciousness. Critical consciousness then will lead to going from being a passive, agent in a regime, complaining but not doing anything, to being active. So I mean, there's two examples of it. The other example, really, I think, also of critical consciousness would be Syria, and I don't know what protests are how protests are going in Syria. I mean, critical consciousness often gets squashed by an authoritarian, totalitarian regime. Okay, so the crisis that gives rise to it then gets, and by squashed I mean people get killed. Then it kind of dissipates out of like trying to stay alive, and it will come back again as critical consciousness in points of crisis. So critical consciousness is a really important term for Lukács. It's consciousness that's given rise to by crisis, where people become genuinely aware of their power and overthrow the objective forms of society that shape the life of man, in quotes from Lukács. So it's this critical consciousness that for Lukács gives rise to class consciousness. It's this realizing that you can do something, that you can go from being in itself a passive agent, to go back to Hegel, to being aware that you created the world, that the world is a separation of the objects you made and you the subject, and that you start to act as a for itself. And when you start to act as a for itself, to bring Hegel and Lukács together, and he is very much influenced by Hegel, when you start to act as a for itself, this is critical consciousness is going to give rise to class consciousness. Now, the proletariat for Lukács, like for Marx, was the figure or agent that, quote, he says, it was the agent for consciousness-defying reification, for mind asserting its power over matter, for consciousness claiming its right to a better world, and that's a world outside of simple objects. So for Lukács, like for Marx, derived from Hegel's, dependent in itself bondsman, the proletariat is the figure or agent for consciousness-defying reification, for the mind asserting its powers over matter, as over the object world, for consciousness as a for itself claiming its theoretical right to a better world, and to a world that's outside of the separation of objects and subjects, where objects are dominating the subject. Now, are you guys with me on the Lukács here? Do you want any questions or clarifications? I mean, you get why Said is, and I'm going to assume you're probably really busy, and like, have people maybe not read the article except for people that are presenting? Is that a fair assumption or no? Yeah, it is. Okay, so it's a good piece. It's a really good piece. It's a good piece for the way it does theory. The content that Said provides is is exactly what he's talking about. It's very contemporary at the time he's providing it in 82 on the resurgence of Lukács. You know, if Said was writing it today, he'd probably use different theorists. Because what he's trying to get across is that there's a point of origin. For Lukács, the point of origin is Hegel, then Marx, then Lukács, then his students, and then students of his students. But you could have taken a look at other theorists, and you could have said, okay, let's take a look at Beatrice Spivak. You know, what's her point of origin? Well, her point of origin basically is Marx, and how that develops in terms of subaltern, okay? So you would take that again through, I mean, that's why Hegel and Marx, for all the problems with them, and for all their having been founded in the times they're in, and then being used in different times differently to take into account the changes, which is really important. That's why Hegel and Marx are so profoundly important, because people take them, and there's almost every thinker, I'm trying to think, like almost every thinker on the course has been influenced by Hegel and Marx, and often by Kant too, but for sure Hegel and Marx. It's almost like their theory will travel through different thinkers at different points in time. But you can see Hegel's, that whole section on self-consciousness, you can see that like just sort of in the background or hovering in modern political thought. As you can see, Marx's concepts of alienation, his concepts of commodity fetishism and labor power, they're there. Because modern political thought, in a lot of instances, is talking about exploitation. So where do you go to understand exploitation and to develop a theory from it? You probably go to Hegel on recognition, then you move to Marx on alienation. So Said makes this point that Lukács developed his theory of reification in a particular historical configuration. That is 1919, it's published in 1923. He developed it in 1919, the Hungarian Soviet Republic, where there's a crisis. There's a crisis in food, there's a crisis in independent thought, there's a crisis with an authoritarian government. So he developed his theory of reification in this particular historical configuration. It travels, and when it travels, where Lukács is looking, where Said's looking at it, it travels with somebody you probably haven't heard of, Lucien Goldman. It travels, 1971 his book comes out in France. 1976 it comes out in English. It travels in literary theory. It travels lots of other places too. So if you were doing a political theorist, I mean, Lukács then travels into, both cultural theory, political theory. But what Said's looking at is Lucien Goldman. And he says, okay, you've got this revolutionary moment of crisis that Lukács is talking about. The Hungarian Revolution of 1919. When it travels with his student, Lucien Goldman, to Paris, the application then shifts. It shifts from a revolutionary situation to a simply intellectual situation. Now, a lot of this has happened a lot with Marx. Okay, so Marx has shifted from a revolutionary situation to simply an intellectual situation around universities. And then at a certain point in crisis, Marx will come up again in relation to what Lukács would call the separation of the subject from the objects of the world and their domination by the objects. So the application in France shifts from a revolutionary situation in Hungary to this intellectual situation. So what Goldman does is he takes Lukács's theory of class consciousness that Lukács has developed from his signature concept of reification. So he takes class consciousness, and I'm going to say, Said tries not to say this, but he waters it down. Okay? he waters it down to collective consciousness. So he takes a really loaded concept that has been developed, that Lukács has developed from Hegel's recognition, from Marx's alienation, and that Lukács names, and that's a signature. I don't know if I've talked to you about signature concepts, but thinkers tend to have signature concepts, right? So, Marx's signature concept, labor theory, he's got a lot of them, actually. Alienation, Spivak's signature concept, subaltern. So, Lukács' signature concept is a concept that kind of they made famous, okay? So, what you see with Lukács, he makes reification famous. Lukács derives class consciousness from the idea of becoming an active agent, bringing a reconciliation of a separation between subject and object. And what Lucien Goldman does with it, he takes it to collective consciousness. And he says, because he's a literary theorist, he looks at collective consciousness, that is a particular way of life and culture, as it's developed primarily in these two figures, Pascal and Racine. And what Goldman claims is that these writers, which is a fine claim, it's okay, that these writers, like I would say most writers, derive their world vision from determinate political and economic circumstances. I mean, he states that. And he says they develop their world vision from determinate political and economic circumstances that are common to members of their group. And what they do then is they transmit this world vision through their writing. So I mean, that's an interesting claim. It's particularly an interesting claim in literary studies in 1970, in the 70s. It's an interesting claim because all of a sudden you realize that the literature reading actually is transmitting a world vision. Okay? That it's not neutral. It's translating political and economic circumstances that have gone into producing it. That writers end up transmitting a world vision through their writing. So I mean, that's a very sort of important and loaded claim, which we probably take for granted. But boy, when it hit in literary studies, it really shook up literary studies. Because you're no longer just looking at it. I don't think they're in literature here. But I was doing, I started off in literary studies, although it was just called English, I guess it was last week. But you were doing analysis of plot and structure and all that kind of stuff, right? All of a sudden, once you hit Said, Spivak, Lucien Goldman, you're taking a look at the world vision that's being transmitted through the texts. And that's like something quite different. That allows you to see the text as politically embedded and engaged. So, I mean, I'm going to go back one because, so for Lukács, class consciousness is really a fight, an insurgence against the capitalist order. When you get to Goldman's collective consciousness, it is a world vision that is but it's an important observation. It's an important political way of doing literary theory, but it's a collective world vision that's expressed by the writings of authors. Now, if we go back to Said's four conditions of traveling theory, okay? So if we go all the way back to the four conditions of traveling theory, I think I'll do it this way. I think we're right there. Yeah. Like the four patterns of traveling theory. If we go back to those, so there's a point of origin, that there's a distance travel, a passage through various contexts in which the idea or ideas move and are transplanted. There's a set of conditions, which confront when they come into Paris in the 70s, there's a set of conditions there which confront the transplanted theory. And what you get is a fully or partially accommodated idea that's different than its original use, that is transformed by its new uses, its new position in time and place. So if we go back to that, then we're going to go here. Okay. Goldman's work isn't a misreading. I want to go back one just to go. Goldman's work is not a misreading. I mean, if you call it a misreading, you're not paying attention to history and the situation that Goldman thought and wrote in. You know, it's not a misreading of Lukács, it's addressing Lukács's key concepts in a different situation and a different time in history. That's to say that the Hungary of 1919 and post-World War II Paris are really different environments. So Said says in Traveling Theory, in measuring Lukács and Goldman against each other, we have to recognize the extent to which theory is, and this is crucially important, okay? So it doesn't matter if he's talking about Lukács or Goldman or who he's talking about, it's the idea of the extent to which theory is a response to specific social and historical situations in which the intellectual is a part. Then later you see if it endures. The theory doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? It's a response to social, political, economic conditions of which the person writing is a part of. In the case of Lukács and Goldman, what happens is this insurrectory consciousness, this radical consciousness that becomes, you know, class consciousness in Lukács becomes, in literature, a tragic vision of the world. In the literature that Goldman is looking at, in Pascal and Rancine, what you get is a world view, a world vision of a tragic vision. So what Said then does is he looks at how Lukács and Goldman's ideas of class consciousness and collective consciousness that are developed in a different time and place in history, and that contribute to a different totality, one contributing to the revolution against capitalist reification in Hungary, and the second contributing to a world vision of understanding reality, are taken by this very famous Marxist literary critic, Raymond Williams, 1973, who was at Cambridge, who really, again, people still quote Raymond Williams. And they still quote, you know, The Country and the City, his work on television, his work. Williams really took a look at popular culture. So, it's redeployed. And with Williams, who's influenced by Lukács and by Goldman, and thereby also influenced by Hegel and Marx, and, you know, Raymond Williams is a Marxist. It's redeployed, he redeploys it as a reflective way of engaging literary texts. So Lukács and Goldman's ideas of class consciousness and collective consciousness that each contribute to a different totality are taken up by Raymond Williams, Marxist literary critic, and they're redeployed as a reflective way of engaging literary texts. So really, what started as committed revolutionary theory with Lukács, drawn in Hegel and Marx, becomes literary criticism with Williams, and looking at the politics embedded in text. Spivak responds to this. Spivak critiques this. Said critiques this. Said and Spivak bring the politics back into literary theory. Not to say that Raymond Williams wasn't quite political, as was Goldman, but they bring direct politics of countries and peoples into it. Said suggests that once an idea gains currency, because it's effective, because it's powerful, then it's got currency. Then as it journeys, it's going to end up being reduced, it's going to end up being codified, it's going to end up being institutionalized, it's going to end up being, I would say, de-radicalized. It's not going to have that sort of strong political drive that it had when it was developed. That is, Lukács's incredibly complex understanding of the phenomenon of reification that comes out of Hegel and Marx ends up turning into this sort of reflection theory. The idea that texts reflect where they are in history, that they reflect an ideology. And then in so doing, the theorist who's doing it has learned from somebody else's theory. And they can see the limitations of that theory. They can enliven it. But there are risks. And one of the risks that Said sees is that theory develops out of a revolutionary situation. It begins to be used, it travels, it gains wide acceptance, and it gets reduced. You know, it gets reduced to the simple concept. He says, the problem is it can become a reductionist infinite. This is the last 3 pages on traveling theory. One of the problems is it gets reduced almost to like the name itself. And the second is that it gets overstated. It gets theoretically overstated. So what he warns is that we really need to have this recognition that there's no theory capable of covering, of closing off, and predicting all the situations in which it might be useful. Okay? You can never tell, Said says, how a theory can be used in a different time. You can never tell how it can be used in a different situation. You can never tell what it can mean when it's combined with different theoretical parts. So what Said is really stressing is that theory needs to be active, it needs to be adaptive, it needs to be without closure. And I've got a note to go back to slide 5. So let me go back to slide 5, although I really like that image of Said. And I guess I just wanted to remind you of Said's approach. Said wants to keep theory from stagnating into an ideological trap. When that happens, what you've got is dead theory. As he says, it needs to be, I'm going to go back to the last slide. As he says, it needs to be active. It needs to be without closure. It needs to be adaptive. The last 2 pages he uses Foucault as an example. He says, okay, Foucault has taken historical scholarship outside the archive and into the world of power. And specifically, Said is thinking of Foucault's incredible works on prisons, insane asylums, and sexuality. In all these instances, Foucault links power with knowledge. And he also links this reification of actions that the dominant knowledge does into identities. So if there's no system of knowledge that's not embedded in a power field, and if you're acting out insane, if you are identified as homosexual, if you are a criminal, these are all reification of actions into identities, such as madmen, criminals, homosexuals. Said paraphrases Foucault's depiction of prisons from archival work, understood in the capitalist mode of production and corresponding knowledge fields. And this is what Said paraphrasing Foucault says. And it's pretty close to what Foucault says in his book on prisons. Prisons, Foucault says, are factories for producing delinquency. And delinquency is the raw material for developing disciplinary discourses. Said's using Foucault's work to caution against theory becoming a cultural dogma. So what you saw through the 80s and 90s was a lot of people saying, and you know that the person has frozen the theory if they say, I'm a Foucaultian, period. Okay? I'm using a Foucaultian analysis. That for Said, I think what he would find insulting is if you said, people say I'm a post-colonial theorist, and then they set out what they're doing in post-colonial theory. That's okay. But for people that think it's enough to say I'm a Foucaultian, or I'm doing a Foucaultian analysis without telling you the Foucaultian parts of it, Said is cautioning against this. He also says, and he watched this happen, he also says that appropriated to schools or institutions, once you've got a school that teaches something, once you've got a Foucaultian institution, theories quickly acquire the status of authority within that cultural group, within that guild or affirmative family. They take on the status of authority and they end up getting frozen, they end up getting closed, and they end up having right and wrong applications, which is something that Said is very much against, because for Said, theory needs to be active without closure and adaptive. So I'm going to stop there because we've got 4 people presenting. Be back at it's almost 10, be back at no later than 10 after, and you should be fun. We'll start at 10 after. Let me just turn this.
Oh, sorry.